Hi, and in this first of two parts on what we learned about Battle for Azeroth from packs, I'm going to cover features of gameplay which don't contain storyline spoilers. I'm going over new information on Azerite armor, Mythic Plus dungeons, raids, world content classes, and some of the apparently contradictory statements that have come from Blizzard in the past week. So when it comes to the Azerite armor, of course, I did a video along with a lot of other people when they released the one piece of Azerite armor into the alpha, which of course our bog standard one. But what we were left not knowing is the general pattern of traits the same across all Azerite armor pieces, or was it that just because that's a basic leveling armor piece and the ones we get from other types of content are going to be fundamentally different? So there were a few clues about this. One of the things is they did say that the top row does contain spell altering traits. They talked about the fact that with Azerite armor, you get traits that are going to affect a particular spell. We saw on the one that is currently in the alpha that it's usually a spell attached to each particular spec. Blizzard were keen to explain that some of those spells are class-wide as opposed to spec-specific, which means although it's attached to a particular spec, it's advised, you could use it for a different spec. But nonetheless, the suggestion seemed to be that Azerite armor, in general, the top row contains things that are going to affect the way your spells work. And of course, they're the first ones you would get access to. Now, we can respec the traits. Blizzard said that we will be able to respec the traits, so that wasn't obvious from the alpha, of course. But they haven't yet decided how often. So it sounds like it's something they don't really want us to do too often. I was thinking it might work very well, with talents. Whenever you might want to change your talents, well, maybe that's when you want to change your Azerite armor traits, and maybe it could all just work off a tome, same as anything else, or be, workable at the start of a dungeon or in a rest area, just as with talents. Doesn't sound like that's what they want to do. So until they've decided how often they're happy with us respecing, there won't be any details about how we do it, what resources are needed, or anything like that to be able to do it. Now, the unique Azerite traits. Now, this was something I was actually discussing this with Sol So Breezy last night. We were talking about Azerite traits and to what extent they'll be really unique. Now, the whole thing is, Azerite armor pieces are supposed to be fairly unique. In other words, we target them. We go, okay, my BIS one is from that dungeon, so I'm going to farm that dungeon a lot. And in Mythic Plus, of course, meaning trying to push the keys to get that dungeon as much as possible. But are there really going to be completely unique traits on every single individual piece of Azerite armor? Seems unlikely, because that would mean a hell of a lot of traits. And if it was bad in Legion with all the different legendaries, I was saying, because there's so many legendaries in Legion, having the developers having to come up with unique and interesting legendary effects must have been a bit of a ball ache, and that's why we've got some legendaries that we look at and go, no. And the same thing would surely be true of these traits. But what they said is that there are unique Azerite traits to be found in raids. Now that basically suggests, as if it wasn't obvious anyway, because they didn't say, that actually there are not going to be unique Azerite traits on individual bits of armor. So, for example, let's say you go to a particular dungeon freehold, and there's a chest, an Azerite chest that drops there, and it's got, a certain set of traits. And then let's say there's an Azerite chest that drops in the Motherlode, another dungeon. What I'm saying is that the unique combination of traits that those two have is likely to be very different from each other. But they may have some traits in common with each other, and then some of the traits in common with that you've got on the one in Freehold that's not in common with the one from Motherlode, but may be in common with one from another dungeon. So in other words, it's not that there's only one place to get that particular trait, it's just that there's one place potentially to get that combination of traits that I can choose. But with them saying that the raid, and they didn't say all of the traits on Azerite armor from raids is unique, they simply said that there are unique Azerite traits in raids. And presumably they will be the best ones, because they've said the whole purpose is to encourage people to do raid content. So people who are thinking to themselves, and I know people have been asking me this question, will you just be able to do Mythic Plus dungeons without feeling the need to do raid content? No, because they're doing it to encourage people to do raids. The best Azerite trait. Well, there's unique Azerite traits in raids, and there's no point in making them unique if they're poor. So they're clearly going to be very, very good ones as well. So, you know, that's how that's likely to work. Of course, it doesn't stop a situation where you'd also, as a raider, want to do a lot of Mythic Plus, because maybe there are some cunning combinations of Azerite pieces that Blizzard don't necessarily think about until someone spots the game-breaking nature of it, that could make you very powerful. So, you know, that's all up in the air, but we do know that there's unique traits in raids, and it's very, very likely, almost certain, surely, that individual Azerite pieces won't have totally unique traits themselves. They'll have some traits in common with another piece. They just, you know, will allow for different combinations, that's all. So, on to Mythic Plus dungeons. So they also said, in terms of affixes, we know, you know, Mythic Plus has been a big success story in Legion, so obviously they want to continue that. And refresh it. They were thinking about affixes, and there was one affix they talked about some time ago that seems to have been shelved now, which is the idea that you do more damage the lower your health is, within reason probably, which doesn't encourage you to have full health at all times. They've shelved that one, but they are talking about the possibility of what they call kiss curse affixes. In other words, an affix where you get a benefit but also a disadvantage at the same time. An example being a zone that might spawn and you bring a mob into it, and that mob will take more damage. But it will also deal more damage. It empowers it as well. And maybe the same effect when a player goes into it as well. Standing in these zones, you will take more damage, but you can also deal more damage. Those sort of things where there's a benefit, but at the same time a downside, and you've got to weigh up, you know, what is the payoff from being able to kill the mobs quicker compared with the extra damage the tank, or indeed anyone else, if it's an AoE damage, is going to be taking whilst in those zones. They also talked in terms of affixes about tyrannical and fortified. Now, at the moment, you don't have to worry about those until you're doing at least a +10, but there's going to be, everyone's going to have to deal with that in Mythic Plus, because that's going to become a +2 affix. So if you're doing any sort of Mythic Plus at all, really, then you're going to have to deal with either tyrannical or fortified, because that's been switched to there as well. There is also the possibility, again, you know, to encourage people to identify as Mythic Plus Dungeoneers, you know, so that Mythic Plus Dungeons, there's already a lot of people who do those as their primary, high-end part of the game. But just to further encourage that and to further reward that, so what we had in Legion is if you got a +15, then you got an achievement, which was, you know, also useful for one of your artifact weapon skins. But that's it. You could get it any time during the expansion, and it's that same achievement. What they're talking about is the possibility, they're not saying it's definite, but the possibility of introducing some ahead-of-the-curve type achievements for Mythic Plus Dungeons. And this wouldn't be, you know, across the whole expansion, of course. It would be, I suppose, a bit like raid tiers. It may even be assigned to the same thing, sort of in season. So, you know, getting particular, like a +15 or something like that, and you get like an ahead-of-the-curve achievement for that season, and then the next season there's another one, and so on. They didn't say anything about rewards that go with it, such as titles or mounts or anything like that. But of course, that's another possibility to, again, encourage people to push to the higher keys as well as the extra item level of reward. Bearing in mind, we don't quite know exactly how the gear rewards are going to be. They said that they're very happy with the item, the rewards from Mythic Plus Dungeons. But of course, there's going to be a slight change in BFA. One of which is they said that the chances of Titan Forge is going to decrease. Now, they haven't said by how much. If it's by a lot, then one of the benefits of doing a lot of Mythic Plus, for example, especially if you're doing at least +15s, is eventually you've got a reasonable chance of getting some Titan Forge gear, so you can push above the highest level obtainable from there. Of course, if it only drops, the possibility only drops by a little bit, you know, the chance of getting a Titan Forge, then it could still be worth doing a lot of Mythic Plus for getting those Titan Forge bits of gear. So we don't really know about that. Then the other side of it comes in terms of weapons and Azerite armor. Neither of those can Titan Forge. So your Azerite armor pieces and your weapons will not be able to Titan Forge. So it's really just a case of pushing to that +15 and getting it at that item level, and that's pretty much going to be it. I don't recall whether they said it wouldn't Warforge either. It may be that it can Warforge. With the weapons, at any rate. I really don't think the Azerite armor is intended to even Warforge, but I can't be certain of that. They did say not Titan Forge, though. So in terms of Mythic Plus, that's what we've got there. In terms of raids, they'd said a couple of things without being too specific. One of which is that it will follow a similar schedule to in Legion. Now, that doesn't say whether or not it's the case of the 7-boss one and then a 3-boss one before we go to the first. What we traditionally would have called a raid tier, because you get raid loot from it, raid pieces. But of course, given that tier sets are going, I don't know whether it's the same sort of thing. For example, are we going to get Azerite armor from the first raid? You would assume so. You would assume so. Otherwise, it wouldn't make a lot of sense. So in actual fact, what even is a tier anymore, given that it's not attached to armor sets? But they also said that this 77-day gap between patches that lasted almost all the way throughout Legion, but not quite, and right at the end, it was a bit longer. I presume because of BlizzCon and Christmas and things like that. But in actual fact, they said that was a total coincidence. If you believe in coincidences that large, it was a coincidence. It was a hell of a coincidence because it had a run of what, about 5 or 6 patches or something? It was a bit of a run. Anyway, apparently it was a coincidence. And the other thing they said, in terms of requiring unique utility from particular classes in raids, they said that that will only be applicable in Mythic raids. So for normal and heroic, you will never have to bring a particular class for a particular mechanic. Of course, Blizzard have said in the past that they want to encourage people to bring those, and that's where the class buff system is coming in, even though that's still going under various iterations. In terms of world content, they said that there's going to be a faction in BFA that gives you mini-game type world quests, very much like the Kirin Tor have in Legion. The new smart NPCs, the artificial intelligence that are being used on the enemy NPCs for the island expeditions. They said that they've got ideas of how to use that in other aspects of the game, but they're holding off on it until they've seen how it's going to work out in Ireland. So they're wanting feedback from stuff like that, not just in the alpha testing, but when the game goes live, they want to see how it works out, and then there'll be the possibility to add that to other aspects of the game. Well, what could those other aspects of the game be? It could be almost everything, couldn't it? It could be NPCs out in the world, so enemy faction go and attack NPCs. It might be that they're able to alert or raise the alarm, things like that. It could be in dungeons, of course, to switch dungeons around and make them a bit more unpredictable. Could be in raids. It could be that there's a lot of unpredictability about the way bosses are going to behave in raids, or at least trash or whatever. We'll have to see. But they, as I say, they're going to see how it goes in Islands. Also to do with Islands, they said that it's not necessarily going to remain on 3-person things. There is the possibility for doing Islands where there's more players. So you could potentially take dungeon groups, things like that as well. And the easier modes, because there are different modes of it, different difficulties. The different difficulties aren't based upon the AI of the enemy NPCs. They don't make them a bit dumber for the easier modes. It's simply the time at which they arrive on the island. So in the easiest modes, you'll actually have the island to yourself for quite a while before the enemy NPCs turn up. And on the harder modes, they're going to turn up, I guess pretty much straight away, if not actually straight away. In terms of classes, so they've said survival hunters and demonology warlocks have had the most extensive redesigns of all the specs. So if you play either of those, then it's going to be very, very different. If you're following it on the alpha, of course, you may already be aware of that. But they are going to be the most different when you're going into the next expansion. And I just know from playing a Ret Paladin, that's very different as well. So survival hunters and demonology warlocks, you've got a lot of new stuff to learn on that one. They also said that this made a bit of a statement, again, this could relate to raids, but also dungeons, that they want all classes to shine at some point or other without excluding anyone. Of course, that is a very aspirational statement. They do this sort of thing with all expansions. They always aspire to certain things. In fact, it has to be said that at no point in the history of World of Warcraft have they ever acknowledged that in the here and now that that's not the case. If you were to ask them how it is in Legion, they would actually say, oh yeah, you can take anyone and stuff like that. But they usually do sort of admit to mistakes once it's old. So they'll quite happily admit to mistakes that happened in WoD, because that's not current. And they'll quite happily admit to mistakes that happen in Legion round about nowish to the next expansion launching, because they're focused very much on that. Now, there were a few contradictory and apparently contradictory statements that I want to sort of just cover off to finish off with. They did say that they don't want, when it comes to racials, and especially the allied races where some of those racials are very tasty, they said they don't want people playing a race because it has the best racials. But at the same time, they still insist that racials have a gameplay impact, which completely nullifies that statement. The only way, of course, to make it so that people don't choose their race based on racials is not to have racials impact gameplay. Simple as that. But there you go. So I'm not really sure why they said that. It's just, again, another one of their, oh, you don't have to play it like that, really. Yes, you do. The next one they said was about transmog. I talked about this one in another video, but it's worth saying again here. So they first of all described transmog as in its infancy, when it's been in the game since Cataclysm. And they said that they do want feedback to improve it. But at the same time, they said that they don't have any plans to loosen up any of the restrictions on transmog. So it's a bit like, yes, this is a new system, apparently, and we would love feedback, but we're not going to change anything as a result of that feedback. Unless, of course, there's any suggestions I suppose people have that don't affect the restrictions on it. But given that Legion particularly introduced, first of all, the wardrobe system where we save sets, we don't have to physically have them to transmog them, which was a big success, massive boon. There's not a lot else to do differently, I think, other than loosen up some of those restrictions. But of course, I may be wrong, and if anyone's got any ideas, then throw them Blizzard's way, throw them my way, throw them some other way. Then there was another statement which at first sight appeared contradictory until you actually watched the interview. So when I was going through a lot of what Blizzard has said to various interviewers, I first of all did what a lot of people did, and I would go to Wowhead's site, and I went to MMO Champion, and you read it's not quite a transcript, but bullet points of the key bits. And there was a statement there saying that a Blizzard developer was musing on whether or not Rathian was the last Black Dragon. To which immediately you go, there was one in Legion. He was very nice. He was disguised as a High Mountain Tauren called Ebonhorn. He's been around for quite a while. Now I am actually going to have to step in here and back Blizzard upon this one, because that statement was not actually true. It's not what Blizzard said. So when you watch the interview with Panzer from Wowhead, what the developer actually says is he's musing on whether or not Rathian is one of the last Black Dragons. Not necessarily trying to hint at any Black Dragon content that's to come in BFA, I have to say. There's no suggestion that that's going to be a thing. Of course, we don't know. But yeah, he was just talking general terms about... Because he was talking about Rathian. He was specifically asked a question about Rathian. Will we ever see Rathian again? And he was basically non-committal on that. And actually going, but a wider question is he even one of the last Black Dragons? So I'm just going to clear that one up, because I've been talking about them as if maybe the developer completely forgot that Ebonhorn was in the game. But no, that is not true. So there we go. Those are some of the gameplay things that have come out of PAX, rather, that we can say with some degree of certainty. There was an awful lot of stuff that I'd still like clarified. But I hope you enjoyed it. Anyway, if you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share for further content. And until next time, and part 2 potentially, I'll see you later.